Earlier today, Microsoft unveiled that they will be releasing a new operating system based on Linux. This is not a joke. This is not April Fool's. This is not some dystopian future we are all living in. This is real. And we're going to break down exactly what we know about this brand new Linux-based Microsoft operating system today. Sponsored in part, not the Microsoft operating system, just this show part, sponsored in part by Pogo Linux, who produce some of the most amazing servers on the planet powered by Linux. Software-defined storage servers, big compute servers, GPU servers, ARM servers, all sorts of stuff, big servers, little servers. If you need servers, you go to Pogo Linux. That's what you do if you're a good human. Find out more over at pogolinux.com. All right, let's talk about this. All right, there has been much movement within the Linux world relating to Microsoft over the last few years. Famously, they've announced that they love Linux. They love open source all of a sudden. Of course, they've announced that they hated Linux and viewed Linux as a cancer for I don't know, a decade or more at least, and even went so far as to announce that Linux was enemy number one. Throughout that period of time, they are famous for having had internal memos talking about embracing, extending, and extinguishing other products. So many people within the Linux world, for some very weird reason, are somewhat skeptical of Microsoft. Crazy, I know. With this new announcement of a Linux-based operating system, I think those skeptical, weird little tingly hairs on the back of our necks begin to go up again. So let's talk about what we know about this thing. First, it's called Azure Sphere OS, which is cool. It makes you think, oh, it's part of their broader Azure offerings. However, it's much more than that. It's more focused on Internet of Things type devices. Here, I'm going to read you some of the tidbits from their website verbatim because we don't have a lot of information to go on, and I've mined everything that I can from this that has any real interest whatsoever. They call this a new solution for creating highly secured connected MCU devices. Azure Sphere can help you securely connect your products at a price point that enables IoT at scale, you know, blah, 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 blah. Basically, the gist of it is they're creating three things: a hardware platform, an operating system to run on that platform, and then a bunch of Azure cloud-based services for it all to tie into. Now, you may be reading this and saying, connected MCU devices. They are not talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They are, in fact, talking about microcontrollers. Now, this is a little different than a microprocessor-based system. Just to give everyone a very, very high-level view of what this is. A microcontroller is really the microprocessor with all the RAM and all the other goodies and I/O and whatnot inside of it. This, in many ways, makes things a lot cheaper to produce, a lot less components. If you have a microprocessor-based system, you can tend to have much faster systems, much more flexible and modular systems, whereas a microcontroller system, everything is just shoved into one little package, right? Think of the difference between some of the smaller Arduino boards versus a Raspberry Pi. A smaller Arduino board would be a microcontroller. Raspberry Pi would be a microprocessor on a single board computer, if that helps clarify that at all. And none of that has to do with Iron Man or the Hulk, which is disappointing to me. Here's the general layout as Microsoft lays it out. They have a secured MCU, the secured microcontroller, a secured OS, which is that Sphere OS that's based on Linux, and then the cloud security, which is their Azure services. Now, this secured MCU thing, basically Microsoft is coming up with the design for this with some of their partners and then giving or leasing or something. It sounds like they're just giving it away, but I'm not 100% certain. The designs around that to other hardware manufacturers to create this system upon which Microsoft's Azure Sphere operating system would run. And here's a general schematic. This is the only schematic of this hardware platform I was able to track down from Microsoft, and basically it just shows you kind of what I described a minute ago about a microcontroller. controller. You have the RAM and the flash and the processor and all that sort of thing, and the connectivity all in one chip. So all the wireless internet connection is all on that single chip is the goal, which does make a certain amount of sense for an Internet of Things type device, I suppose. Personally, I like things a little more modular, but I kind of get what they're going at there. You'll notice that in this diagram, everything is divided by what they call the Microsoft I/O firewalls, which I was not able to figure out details about, but apparently Microsoft has I/O firewalls and they're Microsoft specific. All right, but let's get into the really important part here, and that is the operating system itself. In some places, they refer to it by full name, as in Azure Sphere OS. Sometimes they call it Secured OS. They don't say a Secured OS. They kind of refer to it almost like Secured OS is its name in a few spots, which makes me wonder if maybe there was some marketing shenanigans going on up to the last minute. But it is Azure Sphere OS. It is a highly secured OS from Microsoft. I'm reading. These are not my words. Creates a trustworthy defense in-depth. Okay, see, they have some grammatical errors here. So a highly secured OS from Microsoft creates a trustworthy defense in-depth platform for new IoT experiences. When I say in-depth platform, there's no hyphen there, so it's not an in-depth platform. It's in a depth platform. I assume they meant an in-depth platform, but you know, I have a feeling there's a lot of these little errors throughout their announcements here, so I'm wondering how quickly they push these announcements for this whole Sphere OS thing out. It has a secured application container, so it's very heavy on containers. So what it is they have a custom version of the Linux kernel, and then on top of that somewhere is a series of application containers. I don't know if we're talking like Docker here or what, but some sort of containery system, and everything is connected to the Azure Sphere Security Service. It's all connected straight up into the Azure Cloud Service. Here's the layers. So OS layer 0, they call the hardware. Layer 1 is a security monitor. Don't understand why there is a security monitor between the hardware and the Linux kernel. That makes me wonder, is it running another kernel that the Linux kernel is then on top of? Or is that some weird BIOS feature? I don't know. The OS layer 1 security monitor doesn't really make a lot of sense in this regard because there's not a lot of detail. It might make sense once they release more information. And then layer 3 is on-chip connectivity services, and layer 4 is app container for compute. Honestly, these 5 layers here, starting with layer 0, don't really make a whole lot of sense as a layer schematic diagram of what sits on top of what, other than the fact that it would make sense for an application container to be above the kernel level. The rest of it just seemed like pieces and parts of the overall system, so I'm not really sure. This diagram feels like it was put together by someone who was not an engineer, I'll tell you that much. Cloud security. So this is the cloud security portion, because this operating system sounds like it's really nothing without the Azure Cloud Services, and they call this the Azure Sphere Security Service, a turnkey security service that guards every Azure Sphere device, renewing security, identifying emerging threats, and brokering trust between device, cloud, and other endpoints. That's a whole lot of crazy talk that doesn't really mean a whole lot of anything. It really depends on what they actually come back with. Like the things it says here just don't make a lot of sense on their own. Protects your devices and customers with certificate-based authentication of all communications. Okay, I kind of get that one. Responds to threats with automated updates of Azure Sphere OS. So in other words, they're pushing out updates to the Sphere OS from the Azure services in the background, so you don't have to. I guess that does make a certain amount of sense. That's something that all of the IoT players are trying to crack right now. And here's a diagram they put up for the cloud security thing, and their cloud security thing has a diagram that just says, hey, look, coffee pots, garbage trucks, electric egg beaters, vacuum cleaners, KitchenAids, sewing machines. Like, what the hell is going on here? How many things does Microsoft intend to have this in? Well, we'll answer that very, very shortly. And what's really interesting about this is that they're actually making the entire software development stack around this based on Visual Studio. So in order to develop for this Linux platform, you have to use Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Visual Studio. That itty-bitty little text editor that they call Microsoft VS Code, Visual Studio Code, which is just basically a text editor with a few other features, is not Visual Studio. And they are tying Sphere OS, the Linux-based operating system, tightly into Visual Studio. In fact, they say modernize your MCU development experience with Visual Studio. Install the Visual Studio tools for Azure Sphere to get started writing applications, blah, 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 blah. Modernize your development experience. I assume they're referring to making Linux applications on Linux as being antiquated. You want to have it modern by coding it on Windows and then pushing it to Linux. It's very, very odd and interesting to that. Now, what I found fascinating, other than the general lack of technical data around this, it definitely doesn't tell you if they're using any of the GNU toolchain outside of the Linux kernel. We don't know that. We don't know if they're bringing in some of the free BSD toolchain or are there any of the free BSD userland. We don't know any of that stuff. We don't know if they're using any existing package management things. For all we know, they could be using Snappy. We have absolutely no clue at this point. This is not a publicly available thing. They do say that they are providing it to like private like testers and whatnot now, but I haven't been able to get a hold of anyone that's been able to respond to me at Microsoft about this, and I haven't been able to find anyone who's actually gotten their hands on it yet, so I can neither confirm nor deny any of that. But what I found fascinating was the words and the imagery that they chose to convey much of this. For instance, this is the headlining image. This is the image that they put above everything else, telling you to get ready for the MCU IoT revolution. Azure Sphere is a solution for creating highly secured connected MCU devices, providing you with the confidence and the power to reimagine your businesses and create the future. But the picture they chose to put it over looks like a spy drone looking at a neighborhood and looking at all the houses and cars in the neighborhood and watching people, which, if you're trying to make people feel comfortable about the security and not being surveilled and data collected by IoT devices, I wouldn't think you'd go with that. I mean, that's like that's like one step better than like having a picture of a guy in like a spy hat, like the Mad Magazine Spy versus Spy, like sneaking outside your window. It's just one step better than that. That I thought was weird, and it kind of set the tone for all the videos that they unleashed, and the videos were fascinating. I highly recommend watching these. Go to the Microsoft Sphere website. If you just look for Microsoft Sphere, you'll find it right away. And there's two videos there, and they are short, and I found them deeply disturbing. This is the first one. This is what they call their leadership vision video. This guy, and I love the expression on this guy's face, they talk about how they expect this to be running on billions of new devices every year, and bridging and connecting all of these devices to the cloud. And then they begin showing graphics about how your microwave, your toaster oven, your refrigerator, your doors, your thermostat, I'm not sure what other things we're looking at, something on the counter, are all connected to Microsoft Azure and reporting data about you and them up to Microsoft's Azure cloud. They're really, really heavily focused on that part of it, and they make a big point about how they are going to, with this, affect every person. When they say every person, in the context of this, they mean that they expect that you will have to have Microsoft Sphere OS hardware in your home if you're a human being. I thought that was an interesting, if not slightly terrifying approach. But what I found really, really funky was the predictive maintenance video. This is the second video. There's only 2 videos here. Neither of them go into the details of the hardware, of the software tool chain, of how many of these pieces and parts work, the stuff that would be important to actually adopt this in a company. But what they start talking about is this feature that they call predictive maintenance. And they basically talk about how they will monitor everything they possibly can about both the device, how you use the device, and you to figure out when the device might need maintenance. So they this is a screenshot of the video where they're just showing something over time. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, where they anticipate and detect slight changes to the device. And then someone comes to fix your washing machine before it's actually failed. I repeat, this creepy guy shows up to fix your washing machine before it's actually failed. Those are parts of the video. So they think your washing machine might fail, so they send someone out to fix it, which feels a little Minority Report pre-crimey to me. But hey, that's never been a problem. There is no science fiction where they have ever thought, hey, you know, pre-crime, thought crime, etc. Those are always good, right? That's always good. Pre-crime, pre-cog, Minority Report stuff, that's never going to go wrong. So what we know right now. We know that this is running on Linux. This is running a modified version of the Linux kernel. Now, the good news is the Linux kernel is GPL. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean necessarily that we will get the source code for this. So here's where things start to get a little tricky. So the Linux kernel, GPL v2. GPL v2 does not mean that they could TiVoize this, basically, and do what TiVo did, and basically result in them not needing to release the source code at all. So this, we don't know if they're going to or not. I was unable to find a statement firmly where they said, we are releasing all the source code for all of this under whatever license. I wasn't able to find that. They did make some platitude statements about open source and how that was going to help them, but it wasn't anything actually specific, which, based on Microsoft's track record, I am skeptical. But we do know that this is going to be a Linux-based operating system. But it's running on Microsoft-designed hardware and chipsets, programmed only with Microsoft Visual Studio, and tied only with Microsoft servers. We also know that they intend for it to affect every person and protect against, I guess, appliance-based pre-crime. Yeah, those are the things we know. Those are the things we know. We really don't know a whole hell of a lot more at this point. This is absolutely fascinating that this is even happening. But this does bring up a lot of thoughts as to how some of the other players in the IoT-based industry are going to respond to this. We've seen Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, make big moves into making the core, or at least a core of their business, Internet of Things based. There's also been talk about possibly them being going public with an IPO or being acquired by other companies. They even put their eggs so much in an IoT and enterprise services basket that is essentially exactly what Microsoft is doing here with Sphere OS and Azure Sphere Cloud Server, whatever, basically the same thing. That they pulled back on many of their other projects, including their phone projects. They got rid of their TV project. They just kept chopping back on projects until they hard focused on this. And now that they're hard focused on this, in comes Microsoft with another Linux-based system that's basically providing the same thing, except Microsoft already has the Azure cloud systems and services already spun up and in large-scale production. So if I was Canonical, if I was the CEO of Canonical, Mark Shuttleworth, this would really piss me off a bit. Especially considering that Microsoft has purchased a seat on the board of the Linux Foundation. It gives them a lot of say and sway within the Linux world, whether some of us like that or like to believe that or not. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on my own about this. I'm going to leave most of them to myself for now. I'm sure you can gather from the tone of this what some of my general concepts are, but we're just going to go ahead and not talk about them a whole lot at the moment, and I'll talk more in depth about that later. This video is brought to you in part by Purism, who don't ship anything Microsofty. They ship laptops with Core Boot, basically an open source boot BIOS, plus a Free Software Foundation approved Linux distribution on laptops that have physical hardware kill switches. That's about as un-Microsofty as you can get. You can find out more with Purism, PURI.SM, and Lulzbot, who make amazing 3D printers so you can build pretty much whatever you want out of all sorts of crazy material. These guys, they love free software, they love open source hardware, and they make a point of supporting some really fantastic different types of materials, some different filaments. I have got wood-based filaments and iron-based filaments, which is iron-based filaments are cool because you can stick magnets on them. So cool. And you can 3D print that. Awesome. Print little statues that you can then stick magnets to. How cool is that? Anyway, you can find out way more about what's going on there over at lulzbot.com. And if you go to linuxtycoon.com, you can pick up a copy of my game Linux Tycoon, which runs on Linux and Windows and DOS and Mac OS X and Mac OS Classic 68K based Macintoshes and Commodore 64. If you would like to purchase a box, you can get a box from linuxtycoon.com with a USB thumb drive with all those editions, plus the full GPL license source code, complete for all the platform versions, and 3 floppies. A 5 1/4 floppy disk for Commodore 64, a 3.5-inch floppy disk for Macintosh, and a 3.5-inch floppy disk for DOS, because that's how I do things. And you can also get t-shirts over at lunduke.com, including this one where an ASCII cow says Stallman was right. This is Cowsay, the famous Linux terminal command, just saying Stallman was right. I think that's probably more necessary to have emblazoned across your chest now than it ever has been. And a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters. You make all of this possible. I absolutely could not do this without you. You are fantastic, every single one of you. And now, and looking at this screen, I immediately feel bad because there's at least 2 high-level Patreon supporters that have joined, and I haven't added them to this list. There's roughly 600 of you that support this show. That is bonkers to me. That is insane. That is a big enough number that I could not possibly hold a house party or block party and have all of you over. There's just too many of you to fit. That's awesome. I love you all, every single one of you. If you want to get a hold of me, you can send me an email at brian@lunduke.com. You also go over to patreon.com/brianlunduke if you'd like to support the show. You can tell it into my BBS at bbs.lunduke.com because that's how I do things. If you'd like to send questions in for my Linux show, which I do every Thursday, I call it Linux Thursday. Email it to that email address I mentioned previously with the subject name Linux Thursday, all one word, no spaces, because I'm lazy and I set my filter up already to not use spaces, and so I'm just asking you all to conform to my laziness of the filter I already preset up. And any question you like, as long as it's about Linux, open source, or free software in general, and we'll do our best to get to it every Thursday. And you can find out more about everything over at lunduke.com. That's it. As we know more about this Microsoft Linux operating system, the MS Linux, basically, I'll fill you guys in. I'm damn curious what the guts of this thing are going to be made of.